disagree that patriarchy is oppression.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do you think that oppression exists? Do you think that people are oppressed in the world?
Depends on how we want to relay what is oppression. So is oppression just not having the entitlement of rights? Is that just what oppression is? Or is oppression that some people have other rights than other people do?
I mean, my original definition of oppression didn't stand because I couldn't define justice, but I would say...
Well, justice is super hard to define, so I'm not beating you up about that.
No, I know. I think that I would say it's keeping one group from being able to exercise their will in a way that another group is not kept in that position. So one group can't do the same thing. They can't exercise free will the way another group can. I think that would be oppression.
To exercise free will in the same way that another group can.
Yeah, sure. You
can
are
you
not able to
exercise
do
your
that.
free will the same way that Congress can?
No.
Are they oppressing you?
Well, I mean, maybe. Honestly, it does. I think that form of like government
because otherwise
does imply some form of oppression.
Well, then ultimately, wouldn't you have to advocate for some kind of bizarre utopian ideology where everybody is completely equal? There's no leadership. There's no government. There's no nothing. Wouldn't that ultimately be what your goal would have to be then?
No, that's fair. Yeah.
And that doesn't sound like that's what you want.
No, not particularly.
Yeah. So if we move it back, then maybe we can come up with a different form of oppression.
I think it's difficult to I'm not sure what the dictionary definition of oppression is, but so
if you've got your phone, I don't care if you look it up. If you want to have a working definition, we can go off of.
Honestly.
Okay.
But so men being able to exert force whenever they would like over women, whether they choose to or not, is not oppression to you. You don't think that constitutes the oppression of women. Men being able to...
No, it's an entailment of their ontology. So they're able...
Well, yeah, but I mean...
They are able to make a distinction and say that the what you are and what they are different. And them applying physical force to their aims is the same thing that you appeal to. So if that's true, I don't see how they're oppressing you. What you're trying to do actually would be the oppressive thing, right? Because you want to take them and have them enforce your will.
I mean, I think that it would be, there's an unequal amount of force there.
There is, but that's baked into the pie of what is,
just because it's baked in, I mean, that could still be oppression, right? I mean, like...
I don't see how it's oppressive for men to move into men's interests and understand that force, that they have a monopoly on force. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be benevolent towards women, but that doesn't mean that they have to give them equality either, nor that not giving them equality means that they're oppressed. I don't see how that's oppression unless we're using, at least not by your, well, I guess by your definition it would, but basically everything would be. Like if you and I don't have the same tattoo parlor, I guess that would be oppression because it's unequal.
No, I'm not saying, I'm saying that would be the outcome. The cause of oppression would be the exertion of force that leads to one group not being able to exert, the same amount of rights, exert
then
free
we're just
will
back to force
way.
again. So then what it's really a fight about is force. Is that feminism really is you wanting to use the force of the patriarchy to attack itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of inevitable. I don't think that disproves like the goal of feminism or
yeah, but why should they do that?
Why should they? I mean, I guess women's self-interest. If men have a self-interest to exert their will and, use their biological strength over women, then can you not say that women have a vested interest in pushing back against that and trying to claim some kind of autonomy, some kind of...
You could say that, but you're going to end up with this problem, which is if that's true and it's just a game of force between the sexes with the weaker sex attempting to utilize the stronger sex to enforce their rights, then you would have no complaints if you're trying to utilize force for your aims, for them to use force for theirs. And if that's the case, then you're at a huge disadvantage if they ever decide we're going to. Because your moral argument goes out the window. And the reason that women and feminism has been so bad for them in the vote is because they used to have a moral high ground, and now they're a political tool because they have to use force. They have to use force for their political ideology, and they never had to before the vote. But now that they're involved in politics, they're literally voting on force doctrine because that's what law is.
So it sounds like women are at a disadvantage in politics.
Well, it sounds like if you really wanted them to not be at a disadvantage, you would remove them from politics, because then they could have an actual moral argument.
But I mean, how can you say you're not at a disadvantage in politics if you're not a part of politics at all? You're not advantaged or disadvantaged.
Well, no, they were a part of politics. It's just that they didn't have the right to vote. So they still had women's issues: clean air, clean water, education, health. There was all sorts of women's issues, but they would make moral justifications for those issues, and they had a moral high ground because they weren't appealed to as a voting bloc. For instance, 1920, that's the 19th Amendment, okay? That was never voted on. There was no referendum by women for their own vote. Now imagine the irony of women getting the right to vote, but they refused to actually allow them to vote on it.
Yeah, I mean, it is ironic. I would agree.
It's not only ironic, but the reason that they didn't want them to vote on it is because everywhere that they tried those referendums, women voted against it because they didn't want to be political tools, because they knew that they would have to utilize a force doctrine of men. So they would have to vote that men enforce whatever their will was. That's why they didn't want it. That was one of the primary anti-suffragette arguments. And so that's why. That's why when I look at egalitarianism and equality, I see it as a great evil. Because I see people who basically want to appeal and utilize force against these various groups in order to enforce their will because they can't enforce it themselves.
I mean, I guess I don't see how that makes it evil. It sounds like you don't really think that the use of force is necessarily evil, or the threat of force is necessarily evil.
No, then neither do you. Because
No.
you've just said 1,000 times that you'll utilize it to get whatever it is that you want.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's evil. I think that.
But I think
so why is egalitarianism evil?
Well, because egalitarianism is trying to convince women that they're equal to men, while at the same time they have to appeal to men for their equality. It's not only a contradiction, but it's insanity, because it ultimately sets them up for failure, believing that they're equal with a patriarchal system, which could at any time take away whatever their perception is of equality. They can just overnight gone, and there's not really anything women can do about it. It's insane to me to think that a bunch of rich industrialists were able to convince women, and they didn't even really convince them. They convinced congressmen, which is how you got the 19th. But a bunch of rich industrialists convinced women that they were best served being men, and they're not. They're not best served being men. They're not best served out in the workforce. That's not their function. Never really has been their function, and they're